Hey YouTube, Poopslag here. This is TurboFat, an open source puzzle game I'm developing using the Godot engine. You can find a link to the source in the GitHub page below. And as you can see this month, I have added a 3D world you can run around in. It has little monsters that you can talk to. And if you offer to cook for them, you can go into the puzzle mode, which I've developed in the earlier videos, which has not changed much. So without further ado, let me go into what went into the development of this 3D overworld. So the first thing I did was just get to where I could manipulate a static 2D sprite in a 3D world and get to where the movement felt good. And that included implementing coyote timing, where if you jump after you step off a cliff, you still get a little bit of a jump. And in the upper left corner, there's a debug console. And when you see the letter C up there, that means coyote time is active. So that helped me test it. And that's a little console I can activate with a cheat code. I also implemented jump buffering, where if you press the jump button a little too soon, you still get a jump. The first issue I noticed was that when you sit on these purple platforms, your character constantly jitters up and down, and I was able to duplicate this in some very simple demos, including some I got from GD Quest. So I think this is just a problem inherent to Godot's engine. My first fix was to round the character's Y coordinate to the nearest 0.2 when they're sitting on a flat surface, but that was a little clumsy and meant I couldn't have any ramps or anything that wasn't exactly 0.4 or 0.6 high, so I didn't like that. The fix I eventually went with was just to multiply the size of everything in the world by 10. That way the jitter's not as noticeable. A little weird, I know. So the other problem I noticed was that if a character inches off a cliff slowly, they can get to where they're basically sitting on nothing, even though technically they have a hitbox that is sitting on something. It's just really far away. So to fix that, I send a raycast straight down from their position, and if it doesn't hit anything, I know they're in midair. So then I send 16 other raycasts in a circle around them to figure out where the nearest ledge is, and I cast them away from that ledge to where they don't have control over their character and they just flop off. I might need to tweak this in the future if it feels too clumsy to slip off cliffs in this way, like if you're jumping upstairs and it keeps sending you down them or something, but for now this feels good enough. After I got that static image animated in 3D, it actually wasn't a huge step to get the full animated customer sprite in 3D. I just had to add that sprite to a viewport and then project the viewport onto a 3D mesh using a viewport texture. So next I wanted to animate the character movement so they could run in 4 different directions. So I first had to learn how to draw a run cycle since I'd never done that before. Shoutouts to YouTube and specifically Alan Becker for teaching me, thank you. And I drew 2 run cycles, one for when the character's running away from the camera diagonally, and one for when they're running diagonally towards it. I could mirror those 2 run cycles so that they could run in 4 different directions, and we'll call that southeast, southwest, northwest, and northeast. To get those 4 animations to play at the appropriate time, I assign each animation direction a vector, and then I calculate which one results in the smallest dot product with the player's current velocity vector, and that tells me which animation corresponds to the direction they're running. With all this animation logic, the customer class now has over 600 lines of code, so it definitely needs to be split up. I'm looking to push some of this logic down into the child objects. So I put a lot into making these dialog windows look nice. You can see they're sort of stretching and oozing. The text sits still so you can still read it. There's this nice little pattern behind it and the colors are noticeable. So hopefully it'll help you associate the dialogue with the current speaker and to give each speaker maybe a little bit more personality. As always, I started with a little sketch to give myself some guidance as to what I wanted the final stuff to look like. If I started by coding first, I probably would have ended up with something ugly and rectangular because that's what's easy. So I drew some big ovals and some small ovals to act as the borders, and then I also drew some patterns to go inside them. The textures are applied and wiggled around with this shader, which surprisingly wasn't that hard to write. Maybe I'm getting better with that stuff. It also has some logic for prompting the user with branching dialog. These dialog branches are stored in JSON files. I also did some work on the camera, which now predicts the player's movement, and it tries to zoom in on the direction which you're moving in. If you start a conversation, the camera zooms in on you, but you still have freedom to move around. And if you decide to run away from the character you're talking to, the camera eventually zooms out so you can see where you're going. So I knew I wanted the characters to express emotion during conversations, and different games approach this in different ways. Some like Disgaea will have giant portraits above the text, and some like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon will have small icons next to the chat windows. I decided to have the characters emote themselves, because it might be more immersive and surprisingly was probably less work. So first I had to draw some art assets for what I wanted each of the emotes to look like. The animations themselves are controlled by an animation player. And the coolest thing is, the way I designed them, it doesn't actually depend on the character's appearance or mouth, just on making their eyes invisible. So in the future, if I have 20 or 30 characters, I might only have to redraw these emotions a handful of times. After I implemented this fancy dialogue system and these new emotes, though, I noticed the game's loading times are getting a lot worse. It now took about 5 or 10 seconds to load up the overworld, and worse yet, even if you loaded it up multiple times, it didn't get any faster. It was slow every time. My first idea was maybe to load up these textures in the background, but this ended up being a dead end because every time a resource is loaded, even if it's on a different thread, everything just locks up for a half a second. So even if they're just navigating a menu, it just looked bad. I ended up writing some code which scans the assets directory for all of the PNGs in my game and preloads them and keeps them in memory for the entire time the game is running. This way the game takes about 5 or 10 seconds to start up, but after that initial load, it's fast the whole rest of the time. I measured what was making this load so slowly, and I figured out that some of these PNGs are so large, maybe 10,000 by 10,000 pixels, that it takes about a half second just to load that one texture into memory. This can be sped up considerably if the sprite is either packed or if it shrinks so that rather than having a 10,000 by 10,000 aliased texture, I have a 5,000 by 5,000 anti-alias texture. Either of those options makes it considerably faster, so I'll have to do that in the future. I also made some adjustments to the puzzle mode. I greatly increased the amount of floor kicks and lock resets so that slow players can play slower, while also decreasing mandatory delays such as the appearance delay so that fast players can play faster. Hopefully this gives experienced players the ability to demonstrate their skill without feeling shackled by a speed limit. I also liked the diagnostic cheat code on the overworld, so I added a similar one to the puzzle mode where I can see what state the piece is in and how many frames it's been in that state. This helps me track down timing bugs where a piece sits in one state for too long or skips over a state entirely. So unfortunately, that's all I got done this month. There's still a lot left to do. The overworld, I want to not be all checkerboard and placeholder sprites. I want it to have, grass and paths and a little decoration, maybe houses and stuff that people live in. I also want to get to where when you solve puzzles, you get money that you can eventually, not next month, but eventually spend in the overworld, and you'll see, okay, this is the progression system. You solve some puzzles, you get some money, and eventually that'll do stuff. So I want the money part in there. And then I also want to get the day-night cycle to where you only have so much time in a day to do stuff, and then you have to go to bed, and then the next day, maybe new people are around and there's new things to do. So that's on the plate for next month. Hope you'll join me then.